Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey to the automotive world. We talk about the latest news, from new makes and models to new technology to all of the must-have options available. Whether you're a fan of the old classics, love the latest models and technology, or have never met a vehicle you didn't want to work on, the GSMC Car Podcast has something for every car enthusiast.
Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, David Lucy Mabel. All right, so today, folks, we are going to be talking about the most influential car of the 2000s. And by the 2000s, I don't mean the entirety of the 21st century thus far. I mean from 2000 to 2009, that first decade of the 21st century. So let's get started. As you all know, that we've been doing a podcast on the most influential cars of every decade. We're winding down. It's coming to an end. After this decade, we got the 2010s and we got the 2020s. And that'll be it. So here we are. It's the 2000s. Y2K was a thing in the late 90s. They ended up figuring out it wasn't that great of a deal. They figured it out. They saved the world, blah, blah, blah. The September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks have happened, changed the world forever, changed our country forever. So many people lost their innocence that day. Terrible, terrible things happened. But anyway, we are in the 2000s. So this was a decade of a lot of technological innovation, a lot of moving forward. Honestly, at the beginning of the decade, you know, things like texting and smartphones and whatnot, you know, were not so popular. But by the time 2009 rolled around, we had smartphones, we had texting, we had video calls, we had all sorts of foolishness. So the 2000s, a period of great technological innovation. But anyway, let's get started. So what do I think is the most influential car of the 2000s? I might get some heat for this, but I believe the most influential car of the 2000s is the Pontiac Aztec. And I will give you a moment to mull over that. Okay, moment over. So why do I think the Pontiac Aztec is the most influential car of the 2000s? Well, you'll soon find out. We're going to go over the history. We're going to go over the specifications. We're going to go over some other things that were happening in the 2000s, including some other influential cars. And in segment 4, I'll give you my personal thoughts, and I will update you as to the backlash that I have gotten on the Facebook group Unpopular Car Opinions about me saying that the McLaren F1 is not the greatest car ever made. But anyway, moving on. So the Pontiac Aztec was built for the 2001 to 2005 model years. The Pontiac Aztec was an early crossover made by the now defunct Pontiac Motor Company. It was joined by its corporate cousin, the slightly better looking Buick Rendezvous. Now notice how I said slightly better looking. These first attempts at a crossover by GM, whew, man. Ay, ay, ay. Anyway, you'll hear more about it. There are some very colorful descriptions on the looks of the Pontiac Aztec. And far be it from me to assume that none of you all have seen one of these. So you all have seen the Pontiac Aztec, and of course there will be a picture on the Instagram soon enough. You will see why people are not quite a fan of this design, but I digress. So despite being absolutely hideous, it was a well-appointed, competent vehicle that set the tone for the future of the American car market. Now, you all have heard me gripe, moan, and complain for quite some time now about how everybody these days is just buying boring crossovers that all look the same. Well, how did that start? That started with cars like the Pontiac Aztek being developed in the late 90s, early 2000s. this was a time in which, the car market had begun to shift. SUVs had become a bit more popular. SUVs had existed for quite some time, but they didn't really come into their own and come into what they're known for up until probably the 90s. And that's when you started having some luxury vehicles. That's when you start having some luxury SUVs, some compact SUVs, some mid-size SUVs. The SUV market became just as diverse as the sedan market, in which sedans were still the best-selling vehicles in America at this time. But conceivably, an SUV was a practical vehicle that you could drive every day. A long time ago, when SUVs were first, conceived of, an SUV was essentially just a pickup truck with, a box over the bed. They were very utilitarian, very Spartan. This is not something you could conceivably drive every day. It was uncomfortable. It was meant for work and work alone. It was not something that was meant to do all things, to be the all-encompassing vehicle. Like, SUVs and crossovers that eventually spawned from SUVs are so ubiquitous today. Everybody has one. And if everybody doesn't have one, everybody knows someone who has one. Like, the crossover has become so ubiquitous. Well, this is how it started. Let me just give a brief bit of history. Now, of course, this is a GM vehicle. So Ford had been dabbling with SUVs probably since the mid-90s. There was the Ford Explorer. There had been the Ford Bronco for quite some time, but the Ford Bronco was still, it was a full-size truck frame, but it was a two-door SUV. It was not a four-door family SUV. The Explorer, things like the Jeep Cherokee XJ, those were vehicles, Chevy Blazer, GMC Jimmy, those small SUVs, those were, sort of not crossovers, but they were like the predecessor to crossovers. They were more car-like in SUV fashion, meaning they were more comfortable, easier to drive, smaller, more compact, things of that sort. So those had sort of, ruled the 90s. And of course you had some other obscure ones like the Oldsmobile Bravada and other things of that sort. All of those, small compact SUVs, those kind of gave way and gave rise into what is now known as the crossover. Because those are vehicles that, even though they were SUVs, those were not purely work vehicles. Those could be regular everyday drivers and conceivably be very practical for the person who owned them. Well, GM had sort of capitalized on this trend that they had begun to see. And then they introduced things like the Pontiac Aztek. They introduced things like the Pontiac Aztek to really target Generation X and their younger, more active lifestyles. Now, just to give you a perspective of how long ago this was, some of you all who might be listening to this could be Generation Xers right there. I mean, these Generation X people, they're pushing 50 years old. I mean, give or take, Generation X came after the baby boomers. Baby boomers, ended in the early 60s. So we're talking about early 60s. We're probably talking about mid 60s to early 80s here for, Generation X. So you got all of the 70s, half of the 60s, and the first couple of years of the 80s, these people were born. And they're, at this time, the youngest of which are 20-something, and the oldest of which are just barely 40. So you've got that good, young sort of adult vibe thing going on there. They're not quite as, young and, stupid and destitute as they would be if they were in their 20s. And then they're not as quiet as, middle-aged and settled down as they would be if they were in their 40s or 50s. You got that good sweet spot right there where they're still young, but they're responsible and they're trying to have a bit of fun with their lives because they finally settled into their careers and they're making good money. So, these are people that have active lifestyles and other things of that sort. Well, that was what the Pontiac Aztek was marketed towards. The people who had active lifestyles, the people who had, took a weekend off of work and went camping or something with their friends, or people who went kayaking, or who did all of this outdoorsy foolishness. This was the sort of stuff that, people who designed the Pontiac Aztek were trying to get people to buy. It was, they sold not only the vehicle, they sold the lifestyle to the people. Well, get this. So, this didn't go over quite well. And let me just sum it up with a quote from Pulitzer Prize-winning automotive critic Dan Neal, who actually named the Aztec as one of the worst, or one of the top 50 worst cars of all time. He said it, quote, violated of one of the principal rules of car design. We like cars that look like us. With its multiple eyes and supernumerary nostrils, the Aztec looks deformed and scary, something that dogs bark at and cathedrals employ to ring bells. The shame is, under all of that ugliness, there was a useful, competent crossover, unquote. Boy, that's a scathing remark. It really is. And I'm not going to say the Pontiac Aztec was an absolute failure, because it wasn't. I named it as one of the most influential cars of all time. The most influential car of the 2000s. But, if you all think that was bad, you all should hear some of the other things that people said about the Pontiac Aztec. Let's move on. While I do think the Aztec was ugly, but the practicality and the reliability it offered outweighed the looks for many, and I can see why. I mean, you have this vehicle. In the next segment, you'll hear about some of the specifications, some of the options, some of the features, some of the quirks that this vehicle had. This was conceivably a perfect vehicle, despite the fact that it was absolutely hideous. If you could just get over the ugly duckling looks of the Pontiac Aztec, you buy that goodness, you conceivably really wouldn't need another vehicle. You really wouldn't, because it's an SUV, but it's built on a car platform, so it's fairly fuel efficient. It can come in either a front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive variant. The all-wheel drive system was a full-time all-wheel drive system that can handle light off-roading, mud, snow, ice, wet conditions, gravel, things of that sort. So you can do some light off-roading at a campground because of that. I mean, it was comfortable, and it sat 5 people. It had 94 cubic feet of cargo room with the rear seats removed. I mean, this is something that I feel like some automotive, manufacturers today are still chasing. What the golden standard of a crossover is. And here we had it way before crossovers became the most popular, best-selling cars in America. And we didn't even know. We didn't even know what we had until it was gone. But let me move on. So I said it was absolutely ugly. Now, I would say any podcast about the Aztec would not be justified. It would be remiss without discussing the styling. Tom Peters directed the design of the Aztec, and surprisingly, he wasn't fired. He actually went on, fun fact, to design the C7 Corvette. So, you know what? Every dog has its day. But anyway, surprisingly, he wasn't fired. There was literally an entire section on the Wikipedia article dedicated to the styling of the Aztec. Peter conceded that the styling was not for everyone. I was doing research, and just like I just said, there was literally an entire section, and we're talking about a good 3-4 paragraphs worth of script there, just talking about the styling of the Pontiac Aztec on the Wikipedia article that I was doing research for earlier this afternoon before I recorded this podcast. That's how much people just hated this thing. Like, this is how much they hated the styling. And, like, I can't blame them, though, because the styling truly was hideous. It was described as having an animalistic snout, awkwardly empty and square front wheel wells. I once heard that they described it as if though the person who designed the front of the Aztec never met the person who designed the rear end of it, because it just looked that bad. The design just did not flow. So the person who designed the front, they said, looked like he never met the person who designed the back, because they just were that mismatched. And not to mention this horrendous 2000s black plastic cladding. Oh my God gracious. Holy smokes. You just can't get over it. I mean, the thing is hideous. Like, if you could somehow get over it, you would find that it's actually a wonderful vehicle. But me personally, I couldn't get over the styling of the Pontiac Aztek. Sweet mother molasses. I just tell you, it's just that bad, folks. It's just that bad. GM executive Bob Lutz said that GM products looked like angry kitchen appliances. And I bet you he was referring to the Pontiac Aztek. It was largely regarded as being the ugliest car ever made and the car that killed Pontiac. Now, do I think that's fair? No. I would say that Pontiac was on the decline anyway by the time the Aztek came out, and that it was really a car that was meant to try to, rekindle some interest in the brand. Because by that time, Pontiacs were really just rebadged Chevys. I mean, like, there was a time, the Pontiac Firebird, for example, that had been killed like 2 years earlier before this thing came out. What time did this thing come out? Oh, no. It would be killed a year after the Pontiac Aztek was introduced. It was introduced for the 2001 model year, and then the Firebird would be killed in 2002. Well, it was just a rebadged Camaro for like the last how many generations of its life. I mean, Pontiac at this point had nothing interesting. By the time Pontiac started doing interesting things, like bringing over a Holden Commodore and calling it the G8, and bringing over a Holden Monaro and calling it the revived GTO, it was already too late for Pontiac. The last heave that Pontiac would have, goodness, at some sort of relative, was some sort of relativeness. What was I trying to say? Relative, no. Oh dear. Not relative, relevant. Ah, yes, that's the word. I'm tired. Okay, yes, so relevancy, the last heave that Pontiac would have at some sort of relevancy was probably the Pontiac, Solstice. And that sports car that was absolutely glorious. And then, a year after, like, they introduced it, a year or two, they killed Pontiac in 2009. I mean, Pontiac at that point, I could do a whole, a whole debacle about how Pontiac shouldn't have been killed, should have been killed, what's the debate, blah, blah, blah. Point is, Buick was deemed as more profitable than Pontiac because Pontiac at that point was just rebadged Chevys, in which they were, and then they just killed Pontiac. And, I can't say the Aztek was the end of Pontiac. Aztek could not have been the end of Pontiac. Aztek, I don't even think, contributed to Pontiac's death. That's just a dramatic statement. But anyway, you'll hear more of my thoughts later on. And then, nobody made mention of the various creature comforts and extras that made the Aztek even better than some, of today's crossovers. I mean, nobody made mention of that. It's like they conveniently missed out on all of the things that the Aztek came with that made it an absolutely practical and glorious vehicle. But people choose to see what they want to see. And what people saw was the ugliness of the crossover that was the Pontiac Aztek. They didn't see anything else. So moving on to segment 2, we're going to be discussing the specifications right after the break. So stay tuned, folks.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Alrighty, so here we are in segment 2. We already discussed segment 1, which is basically the introduction and the history of the Pontiac Aztec. So let's get started with segment 2. Let's move along. So the Pontiac Aztec, of course, 2001 to 2005 model year, was powered by a 3.4-liter V6 engine, a 4-speed 4T65E automatic transmission, and it was 15.2 feet long and 6.2 feet wide. It utilized a shortened form of the platform used by GM's minivans. So essentially, what was used for these because, like I said, with my last podcast, I said it about the 80s minivans. I was talking about what I deem to be, in my own twisted mind, the taxonomy of vehicles. Now, let me digress here for a second. Okay, so you've got the certain body styles are like purebreds. Like the sedan is a purebred. And then the coupe is a variation of the sedan, but still the same sort of, design. Just one has 4 doors, one has 2. And then you get things like the station wagon. The station wagon is another purebred vehicle. And then you get things like the pickup truck. The pickup truck is another purebred design. And then you start mixing and matching them. Okay, so, a station wagon, what is a van? A van is a taller station wagon. A van is like the size of a truck, but the body and the drivetrain of a station wagon. That's what a van is. A crossover, what is a crossover? If an SUV is a cross between a truck and a station wagon, and a van is a cross between a station wagon and a truck, but not, allow me to explain. So you got an SUV. SUV is a cross between a station wagon and a truck. It has the body of the station wagon, but the drivetrain of a truck. A minivan is also the cross between a station wagon and a truck, but it's got the drivetrain of the station wagon and the height of the truck. So it's got the body and the drivetrain, but it's got the height of a truck. So now mind you, now what do you get when you have a crossover? If an SUV is a station wagon and a truck, then a crossover is a station wagon, a truck, and a car. Because you got an SUV and a car to make a crossover. So what is a crossover? It's the cross between a truck and a station wagon to make an SUV, and then an SUV and then a car to make a crossover. It's the cross, hence the term crossover. It is the body of an SUV built on a car platform, so that it's crossed over. Now, what this is, and the reason why I decided to bring this up when discussing the platform, is because you've got a minivan platform, which, like I said, a minivan takes its drivetrain from a station wagon. What is a station wagon but a boxed car? So a minivan takes its body from its drivetrain from a station wagon. Station wagons and cars really have the same. So really I should be saying is that the minivan shares a platform with a car, but then they put an SUV body on the minivan, thus putting the SUV body on a car platform to create the Pontiac Aztec. So that's what ended up happening here. They took a minivan platform, shortened it up a bit, and then slapped an SUV body on top of it. Boom, the first crossover. And it makes perfect sense because the minivan has the platform of a car. And then the crossover has the body of a truck. So it makes perfect sense that they took a minivan platform and then put the body of a crossover on top of it. Because there you have it. That's what it is. That's what it is. And so when they did this, they utilized the form of the platform used by GM's minivans. GM's minivans of the time, they were the Pontiac Montana, the Chevy Venture, the Oldsmobile Silhouette, the Buick Terraza, and the Saturn Relay. And like I said, because it used this platform, it had so much room inside of it. Because minivans are essentially just roomy station wagons that have grown up a bit. And what are they? 94 cubic feet of cargo room when the rear seats were removed of the Pontiac Aztec. The front center console was also a removable cooler. The tailgate was split into an upper and lower section, with the lower section having molded seats and cup holders, perfect for tailgating. And the sliding cargo compartments in the floor were optional, as well as an air mattress and a removable tent if you wanted the camping package. It had available all-wheel drive, came standard as a front-wheel drive vehicle, and it had a heads-up display, something that Cadillac wasn't even offering at the time, mind you. The interior was able to hold a standard 4 by 8 foot sheet of plywood and had 2 cargo options for the rear. A rollout cargo tray that held up to 400 pounds, or a cargo net system that weighed could hold weight up to 200 pounds. And they said that this cargo net system was configurable in 22 different ways. With the what does that say? Oh dear, I can't even read my notes. Can you believe this, folks? With a full camping package, it says full, by the way. With a full camping package, the Aztec could double as a camper, even came with a built-in air compressor. And not only that, a total of 119,692 Pontiac Aztecs were sold from 2000 to 2007, even though production had ended in 2005. So it wasn't as bad as people thought it was. That's the true story of the Pontiac Aztec. If you didn't hear it anywhere else, you heard it here first. The Pontiac Aztec was not that bad of a vehicle. How many crossovers today can you think of that can double as a camper? None. They don't come with air mattresses. They don't come with tents. None of those things are not even optional. They don't come with built-in air compressors. This was stuff that the Pontiac Aztec was innovating in and was offering way before anybody even thought that stuff would ever become cool. These days, you can find vehicles with built-in air compressors. They're like off-road vehicles that you can inflate or deflate your tires on the fly. Like a Land Rover Defender, let's say, the newest Defender, has a built-in air compressor. And maybe some other SUVs have it. But the Pontiac Aztec, is the ultimate hipster vehicle. It was doing everything before it was cool. Now, everybody and their cousin has a heads-up display in their car. Now, there's a bunch of other foolishness, quirks and whatnot that cars come with. The Pontiac Aztec was doing this 20 years ago. Here we are, 2 decades later in 2021. This thing came out in 2001. This is insane. And it just really shows you what human nature really is. Human nature is inherently wired to look at the outside first before it looks at the inside. As much as you can say don't judge a book by its cover, we all judge the book by its cover. Even though we're told not to, we are hardwired to judge the book by its cover. And what has an entire generation of people done to the Pontiac Aztec? Judge the book by its cover. I tell you, if the Pontiac Aztec came out today, it would be one of the best-selling crossovers in America. Granted, it would be modernized. It wouldn't be coming out with late 90s, early 2000s technology nowadays. But if there was a modern version that came out with all the features that the old one did, a removable cooler for a center console, all-wheel drive, a built-in cargo area that rolled out and could hold up 400 pounds, a net that could be configured in 22 different ways, storage compartments for groceries in the floor, a built-in air compressor, all sorts of things. If that came out today, people would be buying it like it was going out of style. Dealers would be hard to keep that thing in their inventory. And there would be markups. People would be marking it up because they know that people would pay more than the MSRP for it. This came out 20 years ago. There's a reason why these cars are experiencing a resurgence in popularity, as people now are looking more and more on the used market for cool older SUVs and early crossovers, because that's what people are driving today. And then, of course, you get people like me who don't like the newer vehicles, but you still want the practicality of what a vehicle offers today. So you go back to the late 90s, early 2000s, in which those vehicles were still very modern without all the extra frills that comes with the modern vehicles that makes them unreliable. There you have it, folks. It's crazy. It is absolutely crazy that something as great as the Pontiac Aztek could have existed so long ago, and it is now that we're beginning to see, in retrospect, what a practical, marketable, and very well-appointed vehicle the Pontiac Aztek was. It's not justified when people say that it was the car that killed Pontiac. And even if it was the car that killed Pontiac, man, everything has to come to an end eventually. Everything has to come to an end eventually. Pontiac wasn't going to last forever. So even if it was the car that killed Pontiac, it sparked a movement that people didn't realize was creeping up on them, that car manufacturers didn't realize they were creeping up on them up until about 4 or 5 years ago. This crossover SUV craze that has swept the nation has its roots in the 90s, and then really established itself in the 2000s. And slowly but surely, every year, sales of crossovers went up. More and more people were buying them. More and more crossovers were being put out by the companies, to the point where companies have nixed the car completely. They're like, yep, we're not making cars anymore. Try to buy a brand new 2021 Chevy Impala. Guess what? You can't, because they canceled it. Because the Chevy Impala is a car. GM's only making crossovers for the most part now. Try to buy a brand new 2021 Buick LaCrosse. You can't. They killed it. Why? Because Buick is only making crossovers. So even though Pontiac died, even though the Pontiac Aztek was seen as the most hideous creation to walk the face of the earth, or to drive the face of the earth, more accurately, it set a movement that no person worth their salt can argue against. You cannot deny the fact that the Pontiac Aztek was integral in the movement of crossover SUVs and the popularity that they would gain in the North American market, and really all across the world. Because I don't mean to sound like a haughty, lofty American over here, but the world tends to follow our trends, since we're a world superpower. So there you have it. The Pontiac Aztek has not been treated fairly, and I will make it known. But we're going to move on to segment 3, in which I'm going to be talking more about the history of the 1990s and some other very influential vehicles. Oh, not the 1990s. Oh, darn. The 2000s, and some other influential vehicles that existed at that time. So please stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching.
Hey!
The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Okay, welcome back, folks. So here we are. We have segment 2 already done. It's in the bag. We've discussed the specifications of the Pontiac Aztek and what really made it a great vehicle, a lot greater than most people remember. Because, the common thing is just to take, a dump on the Pontiac Aztek, because that's just what everybody does to be cool. But really, if you knew what you were talking about, you would be praising it instead of taking a dump on it. But we're going to move on. We're going to be talking about some other things that were going on in the world in the 2000s. So some other influential vehicles. The Honda Element. From 2003 to 2011, it was produced. A vehicle in the same vein as the Pontiac Aztek. It was noted for having a very versatile, highly flexible interior, a flat floor, suicide doors, and many other practical features. Now, the Honda Element was like, if I could say it, like the spiritual cousin. Is that a term that exists in the car world? Because you get things like the spiritual successor. But I'm going to coin this term if it hasn't existed already. It was like the spiritual cousin to the Pontiac Aztek. And might I say, a lot better looking too. Granted, this wasn't a good looking car, but anything is better looking than a Pontiac Aztek. Let's just be honest. But the Honda Element. Here's what was very interesting about the Honda Element. And I feel that the Honda Element has really been unsung in terms of its practicality. It sat 4 people. It was a compact SUV. But to tell you the truth, the term SUV, the Honda Element was like an SUV in the same way that a Kia Soul is an SUV. It doesn't really fit into any other category, so they just lump it in with the SUVs. But really, it's not an SUV. I would say it was a slightly taller wagon. Not a station wagon that's built off of a car platform, but it's a wagon of sorts. That's what I would consider the Honda Element, along with the Kia Soul. Those things are not really SUVs, but because they don't really fit into any other category, and they're, tall and boxy, they're like, it's an SUV. That's the same way the Honda Element was. Sat 4 people. You could wash out the interior of a Honda Element with a hose, because it was all rubberized and everything, and the seats were made of water-resistant cloth. And there was lots of different features and cool, configurability inside of the interior to make it as practical as possible. And it had a good boxy design so that it could fit tons of cargo. It really was, unsung. My friend Jasmine Alfonso, of course she's married now, I won't tell you her last name now, but my friend Jasmine Alfonso from elementary school, when we were talking about cars, because anybody who knows David Lucy Mabel is going to be talking about cars with him at some point, it's just a given when you're a friend of mine. When we were talking about cars, I asked her what her dream car was, and she had told me that Honda Elements were her dream cars. And I said, in my mind, I was like, what? Why a Honda Element? And she had discussed it with me. And she's like, this car, you could wash out with a hose, super easy to clean, super practical, seats 4 people, blah, blah, blah. She had known about this. And then since then, that sort of stuck in the deep recesses of my mind. And it's finally come out here, probably 10, 12 years later after having that conversation with her. Here I am recording a podcast and mentioning her name in it. But there it is. I mean, the Honda Element. The Honda Element was like the spiritual cousin to the Pontiac Aztek. Maybe not as versatile and not nearly as ugly, and it lasted a lot longer and sold probably 3 times as much. But the Honda Element was just a quirky, really practical crossover SUV, just like the Pontiac Aztek was. Spiritual cousin. Moving on. We've got the Toyota Prius. Wow. Probably simultaneously one of the most hated and one of the most loved cars in America. It's loved by the people who drive them, and trust me, tons of people drive them. And it's hated by the people who don't. And I'm one that does not like the Toyota Prius. I love Toyota. I think Toyota makes very wise decisions. And frankly, I think the Toyota Prius is a very wise decision indeed. But as a resident car enthusiast, I cannot like the Toyota Prius. It's not against my religion. My car enthusiasm is not my religion. But goodness, if it were, then it would be against my religion. I hate the Toyota Prius. It's ugly. It looks like an egg on wheels. There's that. It's not that it's slow. It's not slow. The people who drive it like to drive it slow. So really, I hate the people who drive Toyota Priuses. I don't hate the Toyota Prius itself as a vehicle. Our good friend Miss Treva, who used to live next door, now she lives somewhere else in Cape Coral. I haven't seen Miss Treva since before this pandemic foolishness gripped the world. But she used to have a Toyota Prius. And she was like, no, that thing's not slow. She's like, that thing had some kick to it. And to tell you the truth, I believed her. Because it had a gas engine and an electric engine. And, the thing is, if a hybrid is built properly, a hybrid can actually, offer a good bit of acceleration. I don't know how on earth Honda screwed up with their Honda Civic Hybrid that I'm still salty about after I owned one for 4 months. But digress. We're talking about the Toyota Prius. The Toyota Prius probably had decent acceleration and probably had decent speed, especially considering it's a modern vehicle. What I don't understand is why people who drive the Toyota Prius drive so slow. It's not like it's an electric car that you have to preserve the range so you can't put your pedal down to the floor because then you're going to decrease the range and you're going to get range anxiety. It's a gas car that happens to be assisted by an electric. You can drive your Toyota Prius. You can drive it at 80 in the fast lane. You can. I know you can. You choose not to. And, it grinds my gears. Oh, my goodness gracious. I feel like, my blood pressure is rising because of this. As I'm talking about it, it's just, So, the Toyota Prius, but anyway, I almost forgot why the Toyota Prius is influential. It's not just influential because it affects my blood pressure, goodness. It has an influence on me. But in all seriousness, it made the hybrid car a viable option with several innovations. Revolutionized the future of hybrid vehicles. I mean, hybrid vehicles today have the Toyota Prius to thank. Be it for better or be it for worse, they have the Toyota Prius to thank. Moving on. Here we've got the Bugatti Veyron. Now we're talking about just the Bugatti Veyron 16.4. We're not talking about the Bugatti Veyron 16.4 SS. We're not talking about the Bugatti whatever. There were other versions of the Bugatti Veyron. We're talking about the plain old Bugatti Veyron that came out in 2005, I believe. The famous ultra-luxurious and ultra-expensive supercar that broke the record for the fastest production car in the world and held it for 2 years from 2005 to 2007. Top speed recorded as being 253.81 miles per hour. This was the car that finally beat the McLaren F1. That set that record in 93 at 221 miles per hour or something. The McLaren F1 held that record for almost a decade. And then in 2005, the Bugatti Veyron finally beat that record. Oh, wait, I said almost a decade, over a decade, for 12 years. The McLaren F1 held the title for the fastest production car. And it's still the fastest naturally aspirated production car. Because the Bugatti Veyron has 4 turbos and 16 cylinders. So, yeah, it's like 2 V8s stuck right next to each other. It's a feat of engineering. It was made by Volkswagen. Because Bugatti's part of the Volkswagen group, this was a Volkswagen engineered car. So, man, the Germans are at it again, goodness, when it came to the Bugatti Veyron. I remember reading about this car back in elementary school when it was still very new. And these were, oh my gosh, my friends and I used to gawk over this thing. Me, Jan Paul, Alex Butterfield, Angel Mena, all the boys in my 5th grade class, Brian, all these people that I have not seen in ages now. We all used to gawk over this thing because being boys and loving cars, I mean, oh my gosh, something that went 253 miles per hour. Oh, lordy goodness. Just seeing the books at the book fair, the Guinness Book of World Records, and then seeing the picture of the Bugatti Veyron, and it's just, my gosh, it just, wow, it really just did something to you. It stirred in your soul when you saw a Bugatti Veyron, you know, in color like that. It would be, from the first time I saw a picture of a Bugatti Veyron it was 2008. And the first time I saw a Bugatti Veyron in person was probably 2019. It would be 11 years when I finally got to see a Bugatti Veyron in person on my way to Cape Coral from Tampa on Burnt Store Road in Punta Gorda. I'm crossing over from Jones Loop onto Burnt Store Road, right where it hits 41 and it stops being Jones Loop and turns back into Burnt Store Road. I am crossing the intersection, and then shortly before I cross the intersection, I see a Bugatti Veyron come in from US 41 and make a left-hand turn onto Burnt Store Road. And I was like, Lord, I was like, that can't be what it is, goodness. That can't be what it is. And it was. And I hauled my rear end with all 240 supercharged buff horses under my hood, goodness, in my Buick, and I caught up to that thing, and I snapped as many pictures as humanly possible without crashing my car. It took me 11 years to finally see a Bugatti Veyron in person, but by gosh darn it, goodness, living in Southwest Florida, I saw one. But anyway, that's the Bugatti Veyron for you. So here we are. We're going to move on to the history. September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center, Pentagon, and a field in Pennsylvania made by Islamic extremists associated with Al-Qaeda claimed the lives of thousands of Americans, 2,977 to be exact. Very unfortunate. Thousands of Americans, and changed the country forever. Really set the tone for the decade. I was living in New Jersey at the time. I was 3 years old. I was going to turn 4 in about 2 or 3 months. Still remember the day. I was in preschool at school 4. My grandmother came to pick me up because they had let school early out that day. And then you could see the smoke way billowing off in the distance because I lived in New Jersey, but I lived in Linden. Linden was 20, 30 minutes away from, like, you know, Manhattan, you know, New York City, where all that foolishness went down. And then my dad worked nearby there at the Satone Institute. And then, of course, in those days, cell phones were, you know, horrible. Didn't have good signal. My mom is trying to reach my dad on his phone. My brother's just a baby. My mother's freaking out. My grandmother is coming to pick me up. She drops me off at the house. The alerts going on the television. The news is going, blah, blah, blah. All this crap. I mean, like, yeah, it was a sad day. But, you know, America has still remained America, and we have grown freer, and stronger as a result of this. So, you know, when we were in our darkest hour, goodness, dawn was just in sight. And the American people held together through this. We're not perfect, goodness, but the resolve and the resilience that we have, you know, really came together in that day and in the coming months and years afterward, because it still affects the lives of people today. And here we are almost 20 years later after it's happened. It sparked the war on terror, terrible thing. The 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami that killed 250,000+ people. That happened in 2004. I remember where I was when that happened, goodness. I had lived in Fort Myers at that time. The 2004 Haitian coup d'etat that forcibly removed Aristide as president. You all know the debacle that was Jean-Bertrand Aristide on Haiti. The 2008 Barack Obama is elected as the first black president of the United States. I remember where I was then when his inauguration speech is happening. 2002, the Golden Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II. Golden Jubilee marked her 50th year as queen. 2009, swine flu pandemic kills 284,000 people in 19 months. Boy, do we wish it was still swine flu, goodness. Here we have 543,000 Americans dead of COVID in less than that amount of time, in about a year. And it took 19 months for swine flu to kill 284,000. So we thought swine flu was bad. I actually knew a girl who got swine flu. Her name was Bridget Christmas. She was in my drama class back 6th grade. But In 2006, Pluto is demoted to a dwarf planet. I still remember where I was when that happened. I was in 3rd grade at Cafferata Elementary. And then 2007, the iPhone is released, the world's first smartphone. My best friend in elementary school at the time didn't have an iPhone. He had an iPod Touch, and it was right around 2007. I still remember playing those games on it, goodness. And of course, we thought it was the most... My goodness, we thought it was the best thing since sliced bread, goodness. Now, of course, we have more computing power in our little finger than that thing had. But anyway, so yeah, there you have it. That was the 2000s. So please stay tuned after the break for my thoughts on the Pontiac Aztec. So there you have it, folks.
You work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year, to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
All right, so here we have reached segment 4. We have heard segment 1, the history of the Pontiac Aztec. Segment 2, the specifications of the Pontiac Aztec. Segment 3, we've heard, what did we hear in segment 3? We heard about the history of the 2000s and some other influential cars and some things from history that happened then. And then now, here we are in segment 4, and we are talking about my thoughts on the Pontiac Aztec. The Pontiac Aztec was a quote-unquote failure that resulted in a revolutionary change in the auto industry. Just like I said, here we are. There have been several trends in automotive history. You had the trend of the first cars, the horseless carriages. And then you had the trend of closed-body vehicles, that Cadillac offered the first closed-body vehicle that came standard. And then you had the trends of pontoon styling, in which, instead of fenders and headlights and every fixture sticking off of the main body of the car, it was all integrated into one flowing design. And then you had trends of longer, lower, wider, long, low, and elegant designs. The bigger, the better. And then you had the trends of downsizing cars, in which cars were not so big anymore. They were becoming downsized and more fuel efficient. Then you had the trend of aerodynamic design and computer-aided design. So the large, boxy, slab-sided designs of years past were no longer that way. And then you had the trend of safety in cars. Big 5-mile-per-hour bumpers and crumple zones, and then airbags, and eventually seatbelts and whatnot. Then you had the trend of technology in cars, getting as much technology and computer systems in cars as possible, in which we exist today. But all through this time, goodness, other sub-trends have been starting. And I would say the trend of SUVs started, probably ironically with the demise of what was really the first luxury SUV, the Jeep Grand Wagoneer. The Jeep Grand Wagoneer met its fate in 1992 after Chrysler had acquired AMC. They didn't really touch the Grand Wagoneer. They just let it be. And then until they were developing the Jeep Cherokee that would eventually come to replace the Wagoneer, They just left it alone with the AMC technology, refined it a bit, made it a bit better and fitter finish, made it a bit more reliable, and then they continued selling it basically with the AMC technology. And then they released the Jeep Grand Cherokee that basically killed the Wagoneer. But things like the Jeep Grand Cherokee, things like the Jeep Cherokee, things like the Ford Explorer, the Bronco 2, Chevy Blazer, GMC Jimmy, Oldsmobile Bravada, all of those smaller SUVs. Like I said in the first segment, they would eventually become known as today's crossovers. Those cars were not crossovers. Granted, some of them were unibody, like the Jeep the Jeep Cherokee. The XJ Cherokee was a unibody vehicle. But it wasn't a crossover. It was not built on a car unibody. It was still an SUV platform. It was just a unibody platform. Well, it became, it evolved into building SUVs on car platforms. And I remember, in the early 2000s when this was still being done, because we had some small SUVs. Yeah, we had some small SUVs. I found uncertain, but we had a Suzuki Grand Vitara XL7. Still not a crossover, though. Still a genuine SUV, but with a unibody frame. But then I started seeing things like the Lexus RX. That was an early crossover. The RAV4 had existed for some time. That had been an early crossover. And then GM started making crossovers. So I remember the Buick Rendezvous. My grandmother's pastor in Georgia got a Buick Rendezvous. He bought a brand new one when it had just come out in 2003. The Pontiac Aztek. I remember the Pontiac Aztek. I started remembering things like the GMC Acadia, the Chevy Traverse, the Saturn Outlook, the Buick Enclave towards when I was in elementary school, those larger crossovers. I remember when this became a thing. And the trend of crossovers, I remember as a young kid, I thought it was kind of odd because I was like, why would you build an SUV on a car platform when you can just have an SUV? Of course, I didn't know nearly as much about vehicles then as I do now, and I understand why it's a practical way to do it. Here's what it has done, though. The crossover has taken everything that cars ought to be and put them in one. Because when you think of it, the crossover, if let's say, the taxonomy of vehicles, and I would like to make an amendment to this, because after realizing how confusing it was to explain this in segment 2, this is a better way to break down what are the purest car forms. You've got pickup trucks, you've got sedans, and you've got vans. Okay, now I'm going to tell you why I say vans instead of station wagons. A station wagon is a cross between a car and a van. I'm not talking about minivans here. Station wagon is a cross between a car and a van. And a minivan is the cross between a station wagon. It is the cross between a station wagon and a van again. So you got the car and the station wagon to make car and the van to make the station wagon. Then you got the station wagon and the van to make the minivan. That's how it was. So now that I've done this, in order for you to have a crossover, you must first have a van and a pickup truck to make an SUV. And then you have the SUV and the car to make a crossover. Essentially, a crossover has gotten everything, all of the purest car forms, and put it into one vehicle. It's part truck, it's part van, and it's part car. It's got, power and towing capability like a truck. It's got the space of the minivan and the platform of a car. There you have it. So now, when people have realized that they can get part of the utility of a truck, part of the utility of a minivan, and part of the utility of a car, or part of the drivability of a car, then it all of a sudden makes cars, which are probably the least practical form of the pure forms, the purest forms, the purebred, forms of cars, it makes them all of a sudden kind of obsolete. Why would I buy a car when I could just buy a crossover? The car has more space. I mean, the car has less space, I should say. The crossover has more space. The crossover is more powerful, sort of like a truck. And the crossover can seat 6, 7, even 8 people, just like a minivan. So why bother with the car? And at that point, you can't really blame people. So now this crossover trend has taken over by storm. You've got car companies that have been producing cars for over 100 years. Stop producing cars. They're like, we are no longer producing cars, we are producing crossovers now. That's what happened to Buick. Buick doesn't produce cars anymore. Buick produces crossovers. Cadillac still produces cars, but Chevy doesn't really produce cars. Chevy is all crossovers or trucks or SUVs. All of the car companies that used to produce cars, most of them have stopped. Lincoln doesn't even produce cars anymore. Lincoln only produces crossovers and SUVs at this point. So when this trend has taken storm, everything that a car ought to have been, everything that a car is, has been boiled down into one form. There's no need for a car anymore at that point. Because you're still getting the drivability of a car and the comfort of a car, but you're also getting the space of a minivan and the power of a truck. Thus is the crossover SUV. That's what it is. And that's what has happened. And the Pontiac Aztek was integral into starting that trend that would eventually kill cars. I really don't think the Pontiac Aztek was as bad as they say it was. In fact, I think it's kind of disrespectful. I used to join the bandwagon and make fun of the Pontiac Aztek and be like, oh, it's ugly, and it's this, and it's that. But then I watched Doug DeMuro's video a couple of years ago, or maybe last year. I can't remember when he came out with the video on the Pontiac Aztek. And it's when I saw everything. And as a car lover, as a car appreciator, I had to appreciate what the Pontiac Aztek meant for the car industry. And I could not conceivably say it was as bad as people had made it out to be. The Pontiac Aztek and its reception by the public, just like I said, reveals something that is integral in human nature. We are wired first to look at the outside, and then after we've been forced to look at the outside, then we look at the inside. But we are forced, simply by our nature, to look at the outside first. And if we don't like the outside, then we don't care to know what's on the inside. That's why you have dating apps like Tinder, in which you only see a picture and a short bio of what the person wants you to see. But you go 99% off of appearance. And then you either swipe left or swipe right. Well, at risk of abusing the metaphor, society swiped left on the Pontiac Aztek. Why? Because human nature dictates that we see the outside first, and if we like the outside, then we begin to care about what's on the inside. Well, we didn't like the outside as a society, so we never cared, at least most of us, didn't care to find out what was on the inside. But if we had just swiped right on the Pontiac Aztek, we would have found that the Pontiac Aztek was a very, very competent vehicle, and very, very ahead of its time, and very, very versatile. But alas, it's too late. The Pontiac Aztek is now dead, and it has died underappreciated. And it's now posthumously has the Pontiac Aztek regained popularity. Not only is it regaining popularity, but people are finally beginning to see that it was actually a good vehicle. Even though there are still some on the roads, some of them are clapped out, others have been preserved, but the Pontiac Aztek still lives on. And it lives on in memory, probably with a better reputation than it did in life. So, there you have it. That's my take on the Pontiac Aztek. I tell you, if GM came out with it today, with a more modern twist, it would still sell like hotcakes. And I think they should. Just like they brought back the Hummer, if they could bring back an electric version called the Pontiac Aztec EV or something, I think it would be glorious. The fact that it's that capable and it's electric, you don't have to pay for gas, I think it would sell. I think it would sell. But GM, you don't have to listen to me. I'm just a lowly podcaster sitting here in Southwest Florida. But anyway, so I'm going to talk about the McLaren F1 post that I had. Oh dear goodness. So let me go back. Let me look on my Facebook and talk about one of the posts that I made concerning the McLaren F1. I said, quote, "The McLaren F1 is not the best car ever made. Cars were meant to be durable, reliable, and offer practical transportation above all else. The best car ever made is the Mercedes-Benz 300D, infinitely durable and reliable while still functioning as a practical form of transportation. The McLaren F1 is none of those things." So, now I got about 39 people to react. 20 people liked my post, 14 laughed, and 5 loved it. Okay, so let me read you some of the comments. I have to read you some of the comments. Some people were like, "Oh, I beg to differ," and they show 2 pictures of their Grand Marquis. One guy said, "Yeah, that's true if you're poor." So he called me poor because I said that the McLaren F1 wasn't the best car of all time. And after corresponding with him, I found that he too is one of the poors. And then he's like, one guy was like, "Then no car is special." And then this guy said, he's like, "You're analyzing a car in the utilitarian sense. The McLaren F1 is the greatest supercar of all time. But as for having a practical car, heck no." In which I agreed. The McLaren F1 is probably the greatest supercar ever made, but not the greatest car. But people, when they say greatest car, they don't make the distinction that the McLaren F1 is a supercar. They make it a distinction that it's just a plain old car, and they say it's the greatest car ever made, in which, in my opinion, it's not. And some guy, well, it's the Land Cruiser. Some guy said it's the Crown Victoria with the 2-valve. And then other person says, people that buy McLaren F1s are going to have a whole fleet of vehicles that they can use if they want something that's reliable. So they completely missed the point of my conversation. But yeah, that's what some people said. Other people said, oh, this guy, he got real philosophical. He's like, "Honestly, I don't think there's any best car ever made. There are too many areas for cars to be best in, and too many different ways for a car to be the best. The F1 is one of the best hypercars ever made, and yeah, I call it a hypercar, given that for its time was above and beyond the capabilities of its competitors and the fastest, naturally aspirated production car for a ridiculously long time. Is it the best daily driver or practical car though? Heck no, but it wasn't designed for that, so of course it can't be." And then, I commented that it is still the fastest production car ever made. So people, took it. People took it with a grain of salt. That's how they reacted. Some people agreed. Some people didn't. Other people challenged my definition of what a car should be. Some people made the distinction that it was the best supercar, blah, blah, blah. So that's how the people reacted. That's how the ill-informed populace reacted. And today, as I was preparing this podcast, I said, let's see how much hate I can get for this. The Pontiac Aztec is the most influential vehicle from the 2000s. It set the tone for the future of the American automotive market. Some guy said, no, it didn't. It was the RAV4, if you're talking about crossovers. And I pointed out the fact that the RAV4 came out in the 90s, and I was talking about the 2000s. And then he said, if you really want to talk about the future of cars, the Prius showed that hybrids can be viable. I'm not a Toyota person, but give credit where credit is due. And I understood, which is why I made a concession to the Toyota Prius. And then this guy agreed. He's like, there's a lot of ways that the Aztec was/is better than later crossovers. And then, of course, a guy jumping on the bandwagon, cheap plastic, cladded, hideous, and ugly. And then they said, this guy made the claim that it'd be a great car if GM didn't want to put Pontiac down on purpose. I don't know if I agree with that. And this guy said, influential in the U.S., thanks. And which I'm going to reply to him if I get a chance, is that not just in the U.S., all over the world, because everybody is riding on the bandwagon of crossovers. But anyway, so This podcast has gone on a lot longer than I've meant for it to be. I'm about 5 minutes over now, but you've been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Please follow us on Instagram, Twitter. We have podcasts on YouTube, Spreaker, Apple Podcast, and what's the other one? The one that you listen to music on? Yes, Spotify. So please follow us, like us, subscribe, let your friends know about us, like our pictures on Instagram, whatever floats your boat. Thank you, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's episode.